Dawn bled slowly over the dead city, a thin wash of light sliding across broken roofs and charred stone, across the ribs of houses cracked open like rotted hulls, across the bones of 1,000 chimneys that rose as black fingers into a washed-out sky. It found Jon Snow where he sat on a step of the ruined throne dais, his hands slack upon his knees and his eyes fixed on the bar of cooled slag that had once been a chair of 1,000 swords. The floor beneath him was dark and slick with soot and water. Dust hung fine as flour in the air. Each breath tasted of ash. He had not slept. Sleep, when it stole upon him in shudders, stank of dragonfire and bells and the press of Daenerys' lips and the feel of the knife sliding home. He had woken on the stones with his face wet and Drogon's fury screaming in his bones. And afterward there had been nothing but silence and the hiss of falling snow that was not snow. He was still there when the clatter of boots climbed the shattered stair and Grey Worm stepped into the wreckage with a knot of Unsullied at his back. The commander's eyes were raw with sleeplessness. His jaw set so hard the cords stood out in his neck. Blood dark as wine stained one of his gloves. Someone else's blood. Jon rose. The wolf in him told him to be ready for steel, and the man in him did not move to touch the sword on his hip. Grey Worm did not look at the melted throne. He looked only at Jon. "You," he said. "You did this." Jon swallowed ash. His throat ached. His voice, when it came, sounded like old hinges. "I did what had to be done. Justice." Grey Worm's gaze flicked to the dead fire. "We take you. You answer for this." Jon inclined his head. "I won't run." There was no ceremony to it. They shackled him in a passage whose plaster still wept steam, and they took him down into cellars that tasted of damp mortar and old apples. The door boomed shut. He sat on a pallet and watched a spider build a web in the corner by the torch sconce and thought of other cells and other torches, of oaths sworn for life and broken in a single kiss. He did not know how long he lay like that before the bolt slid back. Torches threw long shadows into the narrow space. Grey Worm again, with 2 of his soldiers, and another man between them with his wrists in irons and his hair a pale tangle. His face gaunt in the way of those who have spent too long being brave. Tyrion's mouth twitched the ghost of a smile. The accommodations, at least, are consistent. They put the Lannister on the opposite pallet and left them. For a time neither spoke. In the corridor a boot scraped. Somewhere above them, a beam creaked, settling. At last Tyrion said, so quiet Jon almost missed it, "Did he kill you?" "No. Pity. It would be simpler." Jon stared down at his hands. He had scrubbed them until the skin went raw. He could still feel the warmth against his palms, the last shiver. He could still hear her murmuring his name. "There is nothing simple left." "On that point, Your Grace, I believe everyone will agree with us." Tyrion laughed once, without humor, and rolled his wrists, listening to the click and rasp of chain. "You think he and the rest will kill us? Him they might. Me, well, few men are slain for being right at the wrong time." "It may not matter what I think," Jon said. "Grey Worm wants justice." What a tiresome devotion. Tyrion's eyes were very blue in the torchlight, red at the corners. But then so did she, in her way. She wanted to make a new world that smelled of nothing but justice, scrubbed clean of everything else. Perhaps the gods are at last convinced they should not trust any of us with such things. Silence settled like dust. Jon found it hard to draw a breath for a little while. When he could, he asked, "What will the lords do?" "The thing the living always do once fire has had its say, count. Coin men, bread, grudges. And then they will argue about who sits in a chair that no longer exists." Tyrion let his head fall back against the damp wall. His voice softened. "Some will want to kill you. A few will want to save you. Most will want to save themselves. We may appeal successfully to their means if not to their mercy." "Did you mean it?" Jon's mouth was dry. "What you said before I did what I did. About duty and love. I meant it when someone said it to me, and I meant it when I said it to you." Tyrion cracked an eye. "So, what will you do if they ask you? If by some mischief of fate they ask you to wear a crown hammered cold out of melted swords?" Jon had not thought beyond the cell. He had not dared. But the question was an iron pebble that would not stop rolling once it began. He closed his eyes. He saw Winterfell in first winter, smoke fat and blue from the rookery chimneys, the sound of the yard ringing with wooden swords and laughter. He saw her eyes the color of storm water when it mingles with snowmelt and turns almost clear. He saw Bran's face, beyond anger and beyond forgiveness. He saw Sansa's hand on the railing of a balcony high above a hall full of torches. "It will not matter what I want," he said. "It will matter what is needful." "You sound like a Stark." Tyrion's mouth went rueful. "Well, perhaps we deserve one, after all this time." They took them from the cells after the second day. Grey Worm came with a scroll bound in white ribbon. A council was gathering at the dragon pit, he said, a great one, and their presence was demanded. He would not meet Jon's eyes when he spoke of demand. He looked past him to the mortar between stones, and his throat moved like a man swallowing something hard and too hot. The dragon pit was half rubble, the slope above it furred with ash, and the sky the hard brass of a late day that had forgotten summer. Lords and ladies sat on benches made from wagon planks, their colors dull without the light of polished halls. Sansa had come in a grey mantle lined in white fur, Robin Arryn with a hawk pin at his should. And his mother's mouth, Edmure Tully erect and fidgeting both at once beneath the trout of his house. Gendry Baratheon stood with a hand on his belt, long and solid as a smith's bench, avoiding every eye but Davos Seaworth's. A prince of Dorne wore orange and a circlet of beaten gold that looked like the sun at afternoon. Yara Greyjoy's hair was pulled back like a rope. She sat with her elbows on her knees, eyes hawk-bright and black. Men of the Vale and of the Riverlands and the Reach and the Stormlands, the Iron Islands and Dorne, and behind them small folk had crept to the edges and sat in the weeds, watching as if watching could keep roofs from falling. Grey Worm stood. He spoke of justice. He spoke of a queen who had promised them a new world. He did not weep. His voice did not break. When he had finished, he lifted his chin and pointed at Jon with his whole body, as if the accusation had to be made not with a finger but with bone. "He killed a queen," he said. "He must die." The wind rustled the weeds. Somewhere a gull cried as if the sea were just beyond the broken wall of the city. Tyrion rose in his chains. He did not speak to Grey Worm. He faced the lords. He spoke of fire, of bells, of mercy asked and mercy denied. He spoke at last of another mercy. "The city is hungry," he said. "The winter stores burned. The roads are broken. The dead outnumber the living in some streets. What the realm needs is not another corpse stained by vengeance. It needs a spine to hold it upright while it heals." He turned then and looked at Jon. "If there is anyone you trust to put aside himself for that, choose him. Choose." Edmure stood, cleared his throat, then cleared it again. "Choose whom? It would be, that is, I have handled a good deal of administration in the Riverlands, and if the realm would prefer a steady." "Sit down, uncle," Sansa said, not unkindly. Edmure sat. Samwell Tarly, awkward in the good new robe of a maester not yet stained by the dust of a real hall, lifted a hand. If we are to decide who will lead us, perhaps ordinary folk should have." Laughter rippled, thin and tired. It was not cruel laughter. It was the laughter of those who lacked strength for anything else. Yara rose. She did not look at Jon. She looked at Tyrion. "He killed his queen," she said. "The one I served. The one who freed me from a hell made by men like him. Men whose houses broke mine. I want his head. And I want bread," said a woman in the weeds. No one turned to look at her. She was perhaps 30, perhaps 50. Ash-aged people oddly, her hands big and rough and pink at the knuckles. "And a door that keeps rain out. I want a well that don't taste of soot." The words fell like stones into a still pond. Ripples went outward. Gendry shifted, and his hand tightened on his belt. "We need a king," he said, voice like oak. "Someone to bring ships with grain into this rotten harbor. Someone to keep men from killing each other for the last sack of oats. Someone whose name makes us believe walls won't fall." "Bran," Sansa said softly, looking at her brother in his chair. Bran's eyes, when they found Jon's, were deep and unreadable as a pond in winter. "Will you speak?" Bran's gaze slid from her to the melted horizon of the city. Ravens had come to roost on the broken ribs of the pit. One hopped, canted its head, shivered its feathers. "I speak rarely," Bran said, "and it seldom helps." He looked at Jon. When he spoke again, there was the faintest tug at the corner of his mouth. "If a man must wear a crown, better one who does not want it for a while. Jon." The name fell as simply as a pebble. Silence followed it, not of shock but of the brief breath before a door opens. Yara's mouth tightened, and she glanced past Tyrion to Grey Worm, reading, measuring. The Dornish prince folded his hands, expression mild as a cat in the sun. Sam made a small, involuntary noise that might have been relief or fear or both. Sansa looked at Jon and something like a smile ghosted through her eyes and left again, leaving something older. Grey Worm said nothing. His hands were still by his sides. The wind lifted a lock of his sweat-curled hair and laid it down. Jon stood. He did not plead. He did not speak of love. He spoke of duty because he had nothing else to lay on the stones that would not sour. "I killed her," he said. "I loved her, and I killed her because she would have burned you all, and because I could see no other way to end it. If that deserves death, then so be it. If the realm asks for me to serve, I will serve. I will not be the last king you have. Make a council to choose the next. Don't let a son inherit your pain because he happened to be born in the right bed." A gull shrieked. The day held its breath and then let it out, and all at once there were voices, the soft clatter of an argument begun. Sansa stood again, and her voice cut through the tangle. "The North will not kneel," she said. "We will be your friends, Jon, not your subjects." Jon met her eyes and nodded. "I would not ask you to be less than you are." Gendry said, "Storm's End stands with the realm, and with the king the realm chooses. With Jon Snow, the Vale follows the North's wisdom in most things," said Robin Arryn, a touch uncertain, then with more firmness. "And this time as well. If the North is his friend and not his slave, we can be something like that too." Dorne's prince smiled. "We are always our own, but we may be cordial neighbors to a man who does not seek to own us." He inclined his head the smallest fraction. "If he feeds the city." Yara looked from face to face. At last she made a sound with no warmth in it that could have been a laugh. "If I cannot have his head," she said to Grey Worm, "I will have his promise that the Ironborn may be Ironborn and not some Reachman's daydream of farmers in boats." "We will make pacts," Tyrion said before Jon could answer, voice easy with a mastery he had worn. "Like a glove long ago. That seems what is left to us. Pacts and plows and promises to fix roofs." Grey Worm still had not moved. At last he said, flatly, "If he lives, he must pay." "What will you take?" Tyrion asked, in that same reasonable, weary tone, like a man coaxing a frightened horse to take a step onto a bridge. Grey Worm's eyes were dark as night on a river. "You," he looked at Tyrion, "you are to be his hand? Good. Then you are punished every day. You will make things better until you die, and every day you will remember what you made with her." He turned to Jon. "And you build a world where we would have lived if she had not burned it. Then I sail to Noth with my men, and you do not follow." Jon bowed his head once. "I will not follow." It was decided there at last, in clatter and murmur, not with trumpets and not with blades but with the weary economy of those who have too many roofs to mend. Jon Snow, who was no one and then was someone and then was no one again, became the man the Six Kingdoms chose because he did not choose himself. The North stood apart with its own queen. The Iron Islands kept their long, tight leashes. Dorne smiled and made no promises. A white ribbon on a scroll became a seal, and then a charter hammered out in the heat of an afternoon that wanted to be spring but could not remember how. They gave him no throne. The blacksmiths of the Street of Steel dragged into the great hall a chair of oak bound with iron hoops from a shattered wheelhouse. And Jon sat in it because it would have been childish to refuse, because he could not bear to stand forever. The first day he heard supplicants until his head throbbed. Bakers who wanted flour, sailors who wanted ships unsunk, mothers who wanted sons returned who could not be returned. Tyrion stood at his shoulder and caught details in his little hand like fish. This name, that ledger, those sacks of barley rotting beside the king's gate. Davos came and went smelling of tar and brine, promising sails, counting hulls with his eyes. Brienne stood, impassive, in white lacquered plate scrubbed clean of ash and electing not to notice the itch of the scabs that reopened under the rubbing of pauldrons. She had the white book tucked beneath her arm and did not let it out of her sight. At night Jon lay on a pallet in a solar with a window cracked like the shell of a winter egg. He could see the dark line of the sea and hear gulls and smell dead fish and wet smoke. Sleep came and left without asking permission. When it went, it took breath with it. On the fourth morning, while Tyrion argued with the alchemists over casks they swore they had accounted for 20 years ago, Haelene of the king's pyromancers, older, more stooped, his saffron robes smudged, let slip a number. Tyrion's voice went very mild. "How many?" "Only a trifle, my lord," Haelene said, hedging. 24 jars, perhaps. Perhaps a few more. Old stock. Harmless where they are. Quite harmless. The mortar is sound. Where they are? Tyrion asked, because he had learned in 100 courts that a precise phrase is the most dangerous blade in a conversation. Haelene named a tunnel beneath Flea Bottom that had not appeared on any of the maps Tyrion had spent 3 nights sweating over in candlelight. The king and the hand went down themselves. It would have been wiser to send others, but wisdom and the habit of doing oneself what one asks of others tugged hard on both men. The air beneath the streets was damp and stale, the walls the color of wet bread. Rats skittered like thoughts you didn't want. They found the green glass of old wildfire jars stacked behind a wall of fallen stone. They found cracks in the glass, hair-fine but real. "If the earth shakes," Davos said, stripping off his tunic to knot it into a rope faster than men half his age, "or if heat finds this place." Jon did not let himself imagine a match falling in a gutter 3 streets above, a cook's careless twist of a bread oven's damper. He sent men for water. He sent the city's boys with buckets down wells and into the river, knots of them like ants, barefoot, limber, quick, their shirts smooth against their spine, their teeth flashed like fish. The ground above them sighed and shifted as men and donkeys walked, as carts rolled. The glass sang, so faintly he almost imagined it. His knuckles bled where a shard kissed them. He bled and did not know it until a boy with hair the color of a coin touched his sleeve and pointed. Took a day and then it took another. The pyromancers wept to see their work drowned. Haelene blessed Jon with a fluttering hand that trembled like paper. Davos sat with his feet in the river and smoked something that smelled of old apples and looked out at the masts listing like broken ribs. Tyrion slept at the end of a bench in a tent and woke with straw in his hair, smiling at something he had dreamed and then forgetting it. When that was done, Tyrion went to meet a man from Braavos who wore black like a priest at a funeral and kept all his smiles in his ledger. "The crown owes," the man said, "and the bank remembers." He ticked off figures like notes in a dirge. Tyrion offered not promises but plans. He drew a hard line through the port from the Mud Gate to the Dragon Gate and proposed a tax that made sense even to men who did not like taxes. He swore to open the King's Road by winter's end, with bridges rebuilt not for lords but for wagons. He leaned on Bronn, who cursed eloquently and then agreed that if men spend, coin changes hands, and if coin changes hands, some of it may end in a Lannister's pocket, so there was no grief that could not be softened by arithmetic. The Dothraki did not go easily. The first ships left with Unsullied aboard, Grey Worm among them, his face carved from a wood that would not rot. Men stood on the quays with their hats in their hands and watched the sails shrink. Some of the horsemen rode out onto the hard salt flats, and drew lines in the crust and cut the air with their araks and sang songs to a sky that had never been theirs. A young call young, though all the Khalasars looked ageless in their beauty and their dirt, gathered those who had no desire to see the Jade Sea. They took bread and girls and sheep from the farms north of the city and burned a village because they did not know how not to burn. Jon rode out with 300 gold cloaks whose gold had been scratched to dull tin, with a dozen knights in patched surcoats and Brienne in white at his side. There was no translator, not really, no Missandei with her clear voice, only a boy from the Basilisk Isles who had been a cabin rat before he had been a footman, who could make himself understood in the horse tongue with gestures, with patience, with a willingness to be slapped without blinking. Jon sent him forward with a skin of sweet wine and an offer of ships and horses and coin and safe passage. And the Khal drank the wine and let it spill from his chin and laughed. "Fight," the boy said, swallowing, glancing at Jon and then back to the young man on the great gray stallion. He touched his shoulders, his chest, his own chest, eyes wide with the old human language of this for this. You and him. Jon could feel Brienne's stillness beside him like a held breath. He did not look at her. He found in himself, in the place where the wolf bristled, the old readiness that had never been pride and never been joy. It was only the thing his bones had been built for, and he could hate it and he could be tired of it, but he could no more deny it than he could deny rain. He stepped forward and he did not draw long claw until the Khal cantered, then galloped, then came at him as if the horse were fire and he were smoke. Men who have seen many riders will tell you that a horse is less frightening at a full charge than the sound of that charge, than the thunder of hooves, than the way the ground shakes and the air fills with the smell of turned loam and sweat. Jon stepped right as he had been taught with wood in Winterfell. He pivoted and planted and cut not at the horse but at the man's arm where it rose to strike. The blade bit, and the Khal's mouth went a round O of surprise, and his eyes, too, for a heartbeat, like a boy learning a lesson he had not thought he would ever need to learn. The arak skittered across Jon's leather with a hiss and a slice, and then they were tangled, and then they were down. It was not a duel that would be sung. It was dirty and fast and ended with Jon's knee in a belly, and with the gray stallion dancing sideways, and with long claws flat under a jaw and the Kalic blood bright as paint on the blade. He did not kill the boy king. He made of his voice a sound that turned around the low space between men and made his words something like a thing with shape. "Go," he said. "Go or die here." He spoke not in their tongue but in his own, and it did not matter. The human mouth knows the shape of that sentence in any language. The Dothraki went. Not all, not at once, not in a tide turning all at once at a full moon, but they went in knots and strings. And in the end the city exhaled a breath it had held since the bells. Yara came to parley at the harbor with 2 captains at her back, salt in their hair and in the seams of their faces. She looked at Jon as if measuring a board to see where the saw would cut straight. "You loved her," she said. "I saw your face when she crowned me." "She freed you," Jon said. "She freed me and burned my men and would have burned more." Yara flexed her hands as if feeling the ache of an old rope burn. "You killed her. I have wanted to kill men for less. But now you build. The Iron Islands do not bend. We do not plow. We will take what we can pay for and what we cannot, as we have always done. But we will be your neighbors and not your enemies if you do not tell us to put seeds under our fingernails and pretend to be sweet." Tyrion stepped in with a plan that made room in the port for longships and for caravels both. "You can be hired to guard grain from Old Town," he said dryly. "Imagine that. To be paid for doing the thing you would have done for free." "There is no profit like honest work," Bronn observed, strolling down the quay with a ledger under his arm and a woman on each arm. Yara spat neatly into the harbor. The women laughed. "Tyrion sighed." Sansa came to the city when the smell of ash began to thin. She was not alone. Behind her rode men with crests that had rusted and been polished again. Men in boiled leather stained with oil, girls with knives on their belts and braids in their hair like their mothers and their mothers' mothers. She stood with Jon in the shadow of a wall that had not fallen and touched his face with gloved fingers and then let her hand fall. "I won't kneel, Jon," she said. "I won't. The North is done kneeling." "I know," he said. "You are queen in the North." Saying it put something right in him he had not known was crooked. "We will be better friends if we do not pretend it could be otherwise." At the council table that evening, with a map smoothed with stones where it wanted to curl, they spoke of lines, faint and fading on the parchment and sharp in the mind, between the neck and the riverlands. Davos told a story about a customs post where the men took the right share and the wrong share both until they were caught and then went to live as pirates with friends. Sam cleared his throat and proposed a schedule of tithes and levies so fair it made Bronn snort and then, grudgingly, nod. Brienne said little. She watched Sansa and Jon both and felt the pull of what, exactly, she had sworn to guard. The realm? A king who did not want the title. A book full of names she had written with a hand that shook when she added the last lines of a man who had been better than he believed and worse than she had hoped. That night Jon slept and dreamed. He stood in a god's wood. He did not know. The leaves were red and stiff with frost, but there was no weirwood in King's Landing and never had been. The face in the bark was no face he had seen. When the raven came to sit on its shoulder, it cocked its head once and looked at him with one dark, gleaming eye, and then the boy under the tree opened his eyes. "You thought you had no choice," Bran said. "I didn't," Jon said. Bran's mouth might have been a smile. Men say that when they have made a choice, they will never stop making. He looked at Jon for a long time, and then he closed his eyes again, and the raven shook itself and dropped a feather that was not black but white as spring cloud. Jon woke with a pillow under his head and his cheek damp and light on the stones beyond the window pale as milk. A feather lay on the sill. It was not possible. It was there. Word came from the stepstones of pirates with a taste for the fat-bellied boats limping out of Old Town with sacks of barley and barrels of salt fish. Davos tapped the map. Gendry had men hammering at ribs in the shipyards while the wrecked hulks were dragged up by chains and cut to kindling. Yara had captains who laughed at storms. They put together a fleet from splinters and from pride. Jon did not have to go. Tyrion said so pointedly. Brienne did not say it but stood beside him until he felt the weight of her unsaid words like a sword across the neck. He went because he could not be the sort of king who sent men to do what he would not yet, perhaps not ever. The sea was a dull pewter, the sky its twin. The first 2 days they saw nothing but gulls and a pod of dolphins easy as lords in a bath. On the third there were sails like teeth and a spray of arrows like rain. Davos ran the flagship like a tavern where every man knew his place and would flip a knife in just the right arc to emphasize a story. Jon stood with Longclaw drawn because he did not know what else to do with his hands. The first time a pirate ship scraped alongside, the shriek of wood against wood raised the small hairs on his forearms, and men came across like ants and then like ghosts, because he could no more track a man in that mess than he could count the individual drops in a storm. He killed because he had lived long enough to know the places where a man ends. A belly, a throat, the soft swell beneath a rib, and because his body knew where to put his feet when the deck shifted under him. He saw Davos with a belaying pin and a grin like a cut, saw Yara with her braid caught on a hook and her knife flick to free it without drawing breath. He saw the pirate captain's eyes when he realized that this gray man with the tired face was in fact the king he had heard about, and he saw fear swim through them like a fish and then drown in something else. Rage, perhaps, or the inevitability of the end of a story he had told himself. After men lay bandaged, the deck stank of tar and blood and fish. The wind freshened. The stepstones fell behind them one by one, and grain began to move through the narrow sea like the lifeblood it was. When Jon went to the hold to see the sacks piled, the scent of them made him dizzy. Promise, raw and warm as a horse's flank. On the way back to King's Landing, a shore wind carried with it a smell he could not at first name. Not smoke, something lighter, sweeter, as if somewhere inland a field had let go its fear and sent up something green. He stood at the rail and felt, just for a moment, the shearing lift and drop of the ship soothe him like breaths well taken. Davos came to stand beside him, squinting at the horizon as if the sea kept a score it might yet divulge. "You'll make a decent king," Davos said through the side of his mouth. "If you remember you're a terrible one." Jon's brow creased. "What's that mean?" "It means you aren't in love with the job, my king." Davos tilted his head, grinning, teeth like broken shells in a kind face. "I've served 2 men too fond of being served. When a man likes the taste too much, he forgets to eat the bread he's earned." The small council grew into its work like a hand learns a tool. Sam filled the solar with parchment and hope. Bronn filled the coffers by ways that made Tyrion grimace and relent. Davos took boys who had never seen a ship and taught them knots until they could tie a bowline blindfolded and drunk. Brienne drilled the new city watch until they could stand in a line and not flinch and could tell a thief from a hungry man and knew which to hit first. The Faith's high septon came without summons. He walked to the Red Keep barefoot through the mud a day after rain and left little crescents like moons on the steps. He was a plump man with soft hands and a careful voice, and when he knelt to speak to Jon, he did not bow so deeply that it would have been impious, nor so little that it would have been an insult. "Your Grace," he said, "the city suffers in body and in soul. We have lost our great September. The poor are poor still. When a people are broken, they reach for gods to mend them. They will reach for any god that answers first." Jon looked at him and saw a man who had never learned before now how long hunger can stretch a mouth. Saw in him also the power of a door open in a rainstorm, a bowl set down in a street where there had been no bowl. "What do you ask?" he demanded. "Bread," the Septon said simply. "Then, perhaps, stone for a sept humbler than the one we had. Not Baelor's pride. A place with a roof and benches and candles where we can ask for mercy and bring the names of the dead." The word mercy was a wound. "You may have the stone," Jon said. "You must have the bread before." He walked with the Septon through a neighborhood that had once been named and now was only the place where the houses leaned on each other for fear they would fall. He took bread from a wagon with his own hands and placed it in the hands of those waiting. A girl with hair in 2 stiff braids lifted her face to H. Is after he had filled the cup she held with barley. She did not smile. She looked at him as if he were a new wall where an old one had stood. Tyrion came to stand with him on the height behind the city, where the wind tugged at his cloak and the smell of the sea could reach them. Night lay like a shawl on the shoulders of the world. The city below held little pricks of candlelight, the scattered pattern of 1,000 stubborn hopes. "I dreamed last night of a feast," Tyrion said. "I drank, and I was witty, and everyone forgave me." He shook his head, the hair at his temples gone white like leaven in the dough. "Then I woke and found that forgiveness is like coin. It does not come by wishing for it." Jon said nothing. Tyrion glanced sideways. "You will take a wife? Will the small folk forgive you that too? Will the lords?" "Not now," Jon said. The word tasted of iron. His hand went, again unbidden, to the place where Longclaw rode his hip. "Perhaps never." "So the king marries only the realm," Tyrion said lightly. "A demanding bride." He tipped back his head and breathed. "You know, the Iron Bank was impressed today. They have a particular way of pressing their palms together that means approval when applied to men who are not yet bankrupt. We are, they tell me, learning to owe properly." He found Brienne later in a quiet corridor where the sound of the sea came in like a weight, and off her white armor could be seen the faint clouded reflection of a man passing. She had opened the white book and was writing carefully, her tongue caught between her teeth, her brows lowered like a smith's over an intricate hinge. Jon stood without speaking and read. She had given Jaime Lannister's page more words than most men got, and she had been honest. She did not write himself. Not yet. She left a blank and smoothed the page above it. "Will you put my name there?" he asked. "When there is something to write," she said, without looking up. "There is too much already." She lifted her eyes then and looked at him in a way that would have made a boy want to stand straighter. "When there is something to write that is not about fire." The white raven came from the citadel 2 weeks later. It came with the dawn, a pale drop in the gray sky that looked at first like ash caught in a contrary wind. It circled once and dropped to the courtyard where a boy in a cap too big for him reached up on his toes and missed, and it pecked the toe of his shoe and allowed itself to be caught. Sam took it from the child like a fragile clock he had always wanted to wind. "Spring," he said, astonished, as if he had made it himself. "They declare it. The white raven means spring." Tyrion laughed then, for real, for the first time in a span that had worn grooves in him, and clapped Sam's shoulder. Davos swore and looked at the sky as if checking the accuracy of letters against the horizon. Bronn grunted like a man who knows spring makes nowhere to hide for rats. Jon looked at the girl with the stiff braids, who had come to watch the bird and had tried to touch its wing and pulled back, and saw in her face neither joy nor wonder. He saw something quieter and more durable, perhaps relief. He rode north for a time when the first green showed like veins in the black dirt. He did not ask permission. A king learns when to be seen and when to vanish and produce results like a magician from his pocket. He took 6 men and left Tyrion with a hard map and a harder list of grain shipments and sailed up the trident past groves that were new with leaves pale as washed linen. He stood beneath the gate of Winterfell and felt the way the place made his breath change in his chest, as if he had put on an old coat he had not known he missed. Sansa's hall smelled of smoke and beef and the wool of wet dogs. She kissed his cheek and would not let anyone speak business until he had eaten and slept and walked the godswood. Ghost came at dusk, as he had come in other lives, out of the trees with the sound of no sound. A shade more than a wolf, a memory more than a shade. He pressed his head into Jon's hip until Jon's balance shifted, and then he sat and watched as if he had been waiting only for that. Jon sank his fingers into thick fur, into warmth like a hearth, and felt the ache recede by a small, careful hand. "I killed her," he told the wolf softly, "because you can tell dogs things you cannot tell men." Ghost sighed, a sound like the tide's withdrawal. Jon scraped burrs from his coat, one by one, so patient he surprised himself. He left them in a little pile at his thigh. He did not stay long in the north. He would have liked to, but to want is not to do. He rode south again with the smell of pine in his hair and a piece of Winterfell's cool in his blood. He stopped at the Twins at Fairmarket, at the crossroads in that had burned and been rebuilt and burned again. He sat in kitchens and listened to women talk about flour as if it were the only coin that mattered, and watched men sharpen knives not because they intended to cut throats but because a sharp knife will take you through a winter better than a dull one. He told stories of food coming downriver and left with the weight of believing faces in his pack. When he came again to the city, the air had changed. There were small things someone who had never seen the place before would not have noticed. A patch of roof mended with the wrong color of tile because it was what they had. A dragon gargoyle knocked from a cornice laid sideways as a bench. Children running with the long, skittering step of those not afraid of stones. The new sept rose slowly in the place of the old. It was smaller and square and unadorned, its only ornament the light that lay in pools on the floor in the afternoon. "They're laughing again," Tyrion said one evening, standing with Jon on the same height above the city where they had stood before. "In taverns. Bad jokes yet, but it's a start. Men always log." Jon said. "They didn't those first weeks." Tyrion's mouth tilted. "We have a fleet that can limp. We have a road we can limp along. We have a bank that will permit us to limp in their direction, bringing coin. It is a civilization in its way." Jon glanced sideways. "You miss her?" "Sometimes." Tyrion's throat worked. Then he said very quietly, "Every hour. But I also miss things she burned, and men she did not know she burned, and my poor self that thought I could tell fire how to behave." He exhaled, long and ragged. "We live, my king. That is the only revenge we get. We live and we make something better than a pile of bones." He did not use the melted throne as a symbol, did not fashion a new one from swords hammered flat. The oak chair remained. The thing he built instead over the year that followed was an order. A charter that set the terms by which the next king would be chosen when he was dead. A schedule of taxes that fell least on those who could not pay them. A line of men trained not simply to swing their batons but to listen to the tone of a street. It was not much in the way of song. It was a way to sleep. Once, a raven came in from the sunset sea and brought a letter written in a hand bold and certain and salt-sprayed. Arya told him in 5 lines that there were islands beyond islands, that the water changed color in a way she could not describe, that whales sang in the night, that she had not yet found where the world ended. He held the paper and heard her laugh. He gave the letter to Sansa and watched her read it with her teeth in her lip, then fold it and hold it to her heart as if it were a banner. Once, a woman came to the throne room with hair threaded through with white string because she could not afford ribbon. She had lost a son to a falling beam and another to the city watch when men were mad and starving. She asked not for coin but for a marker with her boys' names to be set where the house once stood so that people would not build on their bones. Jon said yes. It cost him nothing and gained the city a way to remember without despair. Once he tried to pray in the September. He knelt and felt an old stiffness in him crack and let in a new light. He did not think the 7 heard him. He did not know if anyone did. He thought perhaps prayer was only the name for the thing you do when you sit with your own guilt 1 hour a week and let it be what it is without flinching. He sat with Tyrion at the end of too many days and watched the sun sink into a sea that had not cared for kings and would not. He knew he would not be the last to sit in the oak chair. He knew he would not be the first to be remembered wrongly. He watched a boy with hair the color of coins teach a smaller boy to throw a net without tangling it. He watched Brienne write, finally, in the white book. A page filled slowly with a hand trained in careful truth. A record not of battles won but of roofs patched and debt rescheduled and jars filled with clean water. It was not the kind of glory men wear in songs. The pages turned anyway. In the second spring, the trees in the street of silk dropped blossoms like little tongues. In the palace kitchen, a cook burned a tray of bread and did not weep, only baked another and then a third. Davos's fleet came into harbor in a storm and the ships stood up to it and did not founder. Sam learned to like the way the dust in his solar tasted at noon. Bronn invested in a warehouse and put his name on it in letters 2 feet high. Yara's men drank an entire cask of wine on a dare and did not knife anyone. Sansa sent down blankets that had been woven in a place where oil from lambs will makes a winter like a warm hand. The Iron Banks man smiled once, briefly, showing a mean little tooth. Jon went sometimes to the room where the melted metal lay like a frozen wave. He stood and looked at it and did not move, the way a man will sometimes stand at the bed where a lover used to sleep. He did not ask forgiveness. He had learned that forgiveness is not a thing you ask for. It is a thing you make by doing harder things better. One night, when the sky over Blackwater Bay was a lid of pewter and the wind smelled of rain and he could not sleep, he went to the parapet above the old yard and found Tyrion there first, a jug beside him and 2 cups set with the unconscious courtesy of a habit he had not lost. "Drink," Tyrion said, pouring without being asked. "To her, to the dead, to the living who are regrettably plentiful." Jon took the cup. He did not lift it. "To the world we build," he said. Tyrion nodded. "Even better." He raised his own. "To roofs, to bread, to the audacity of repair." They drank. Somewhere down in the dark a woman laughed. That soft, shockingly ordinary sound. Cat yowled in reply. The rain held off and then came in a silver veil that softened the edges of the broken stones and made even the scars look clean. In the yard beneath, a boy in a shirt too large practiced with a wooden sword, cutting the air in earnest, again and again, the tireless devotion of those too young to know how long the day will be. Brienne walked past him with the white book under her arm, and, without pausing, she reached out and corrected his grip. He looked up at her with something like fear and something like hope, and then he tried again. Spring did not come all at once. It never does. But it came, and where it found ash it planted small, patient green. In time, after men were fed and roofs sound, after ships moved like fish again and not like stones with sails, after a new charter had been read in marketplaces and argued in taverns and implemented in the slow, grinding way law is always implemented, the city began to smell not stronger but different. Meat roasting, fresh-cut wood. The first roses in a garden someone had dared to lay out in a courtyard where, a year before, nothing would grow but weeds and grief. If songs were made about Jon's reign, he never RD them. He heard only the day and the next day and the next, and Tyrion's laugh when it returned, and Brienne's dry rejoinder when men spoke too loudly about honor, and the sound of Davos telling a joke halfway through a task he would finish before the punchline. He heard the soft bird song that came to live along the walls where it had not nested, and he heard, sometimes when he slept light and the wind was from the north, the memory of a wolf's low, patient breath. He grew into his kingship like a scar grows into a man's body. It did not disappear. He would always be the man who had loved and who had killed. But years do not heal so much as make a thing one of the many things, less sharp in the hand because other tasks have filled it. He learned to listen longer than he spoke. He learned to stand up only when standing up mattered. He learned to sit down in rooms where his presence would have made men lie. When he died, it would be of years and not of vengeance. When he died, men would argue in taverns about the quality of the bread under him and the fairness of his tax on fish, about whether the watch on the wall, which had dwindled to a gatehouse under the snow where a few men kept a fire for travelers and for old vows, had been properly ended. When he died, a raven would fly to the north and to the Iron Islands and to Dorne, and the council would meet and choose another with the impatience born of all human institutions. It would be a continuation, not an ending. But that is later. Now, in the reign, two men who had failed and had been given the opportunity to fail better lifted their cups and drank to roofs and bread and the audacity of repair, which is to say to the only revolution that lasts. The oak chair stood where it stood, plain and sufficient, the melted river of swords beside it like a fragment of an old nightmare that time had sanded down. And there was the city, ragged and stubborn, singing to itself softly while it worked.